WWF, Chapter 5, Being a Concise History of the Politics of Fish. Rarity is the precursor to extinction. Charles Darwin on the Origin of Species. The argument about overfishing ended in the 1990s on the Grand Banks, since shallow stretches of sea off of the Atlantic coast were the most celebrated fishing grounds in the world. For centuries, fishermen came from Europe and Asia to fish the Grand Banks. But in the second half of the 20th century, fishermen noticed two things. One, they had to travel greater distances to find the same amount of fish they used to find close to shore. Two, the fish were getting smaller. As a fish population gets smaller, nature tends to help the species by allowing the fish to produce young at an earlier age. But since the big fish that produce the most eggs are also the easiest to catch, they get taken first, leaving a population of small fish behind. Nature also compensates for a shortage of food by making fish grow more slowly. Once again, it was the fishermen and not the scientists who were expressing the most concern about the size of the fish and the distances needed to travel in order to catch them. The only problem was that most fishermen thought of overfishing as something that was done by fishermen in other countries. Even today, most fishermen in the world, no matter where they live, will say that the worst fishing practices are those done by foreigners. An interview with an English fishing boat captain from the Cornish port of Newlyn illustrates that point. In 1995, that fishing boat captain, William Hooper, was asked about the problem of overfishing. He talked about how, when he started fishing in 1955, the catches would be so high on the deck the fish would be up to his knees. He said that as the catches got smaller, he was forced to get bigger and more powerful boats just to catch the same amount of fish. He had started with a 40-foot boat and now had a much better equipped 55-foot boat that was not bringing in as many fish as he caught in the small boat in 1955. Hooper was very clear on the cause of his problem. It was overfishing. But what or who was causing this overfishing? His answer was clear. The biggest problem we have is the Spanish. Only a few months before, the European government had given permission for Spanish fishermen to fish in his waters. When it was pointed out to Hooper that only 40 boats had been allowed in the waters and they were just now arriving, which meant they couldn't have been responsible for the overfishing in his waters, he thought in silence for a minute and then said, "Yes, the Scots used to overfish." The graph on the side. This map of Europe shows how distant Iceland is from the mainland. The closest country in Europe is Norway, which is more than 600 miles away. The movement to throw foreigners off of native fishing grounds reached its height on the island nation of Iceland. This may be because there were rational reasons to think foreigners were the problem in Iceland. Iceland is far enough away from other countries, without anyone on their borders, so Icelanders feel alone in the world. For centuries, the island was a neglected colony of Denmark, with little money spent to develop it. Iceland was far poorer than North America or Northern Europe, and Icelanders fished in small wooden open-deck boats powered by rows of men with oars, a boat not very different from those used by their Viking ancestors. They would drag them into the sea in the cold, early morning from the lava-encrusted beaches. In the 1890s, however, modern, steel-hulled, engine-powered fishing boats from England started dragging their enormous nets through Icelandic waters. These were some of the fishing boats that were fleeing the overfished North Sea fishing grounds, a fact that should have been seen as a warning to Icelanders. And to many it was. But there was a debate in Iceland between those who thought these boats should be kept out of their waters and those who thought Iceland should get a few of their own. This debate intensified after 1944, when Iceland became independent. In their plan to develop their economy, fishing was given the most important place. A national economy based on the danger and uncertainty of commercial fishing was a common idea in earlier centuries, but by the 20th century this was unusual. But Iceland is an unusual place, an island of volcanoes and glaciers in a hot climate where neither trees nor grains will grow, and children took a small piece of dried cod to school for a snack because there was no bread for sandwiches. One of their few natural resources was their sea full of fish, and they could not risk losing their main food supply. On the side of page 69, British trawler Coventry City faces off against Icelandic Coast Guard vessel Albert off the Westfjords in 1958. A camera caught this confrontation between these vessels during the First Cod War, which ended in an accord that any future disagreements between the two nations would be arbitrated by the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And so, they asked the foreign fishermen to leave. In international law, the sea is not treated the same as the land, and ownership of the sea was not widely accepted. Some regarded it as an act of war to bar ships from the sea. The British, although they were trying to do the same thing to other Europeans in their own waters, claimed that having their fishing boats banned from Icelandic waters was an act of war. The British Royal Navy attacked the Icelandic Coast Guard, which protected their water. The Coast Guard was the only military Iceland had. Between 1958 and 1975, the British Navy and the Icelandic Coast Guard fought 3 nearly bloodless but nevertheless violent and dangerous wars on the high seas around Iceland. Few shots were fired, but nets were cut and ships were rammed. At the end, Iceland established a zone of 200 miles around Icelandic territories in which only Icelanders could fish. They had gained control of their fishing grounds, and they carefully regulated it to maintain their fish populations. But once the Icelanders had their 200-mile limit, the other nations of the world wanted theirs. Countries began measuring 200 miles from every farthest rock they could claim. With global warming, the seas are rising, and some of these rocks may become submerged, costing nations large expanses of exclusive fishing grounds. Most of the proven fishing grounds of the planet are now under the exclusive control of a single nation or group of nations. Most countries, once they gained control of their fishing grounds, increased their fishing. In the late 1970s, many governments invested money in building up fishing fleets. Both fishermen and governments reasoned that because they had removed the cause of overfishing, foreigners, they were now free to catch more fish. They built larger boats with better equipment. At first, many more fish were caught and more money was made, But in time, the 200-mile limit was a disaster. Some governments, like the United States, made money available for fishermen to buy new boats. Others, such as Canada, built fishing fleets themselves. For a time, it worked well for Canada, especially Newfoundland and Labrador, a poor province that survived almost entirely on fishing for cod. Fishermen, fish companies, and the Canadian government were all making money. Fish, an important export for Canada, was helping the country to bring in money from other countries. Thanks to the new 200-mile limit, almost everyone in Atlantic Canada was happy for more than 10 years. But there was one unhappy group, a group of fishermen in Newfoundland. These were tough and hardy men who lived in little villages along the coast and went to sea the way their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had in small wooden boats called skiffs. They dropped tarps made of knotted rope and left them there until they filled with cod and were ready to haul up. Or they fished with a baited hook on a line that they hauled up by hand. It was dangerous work in icy waters full of treacherous icebergs that had broken off from the polar cap. The water was so cold that they would freeze to death in minutes if they fell in. When their catches got smaller and smaller, they thought it was because the big new boats far out at sea were taking all the fish. At that point, it was only their inshore fish that were vanishing, so the deep water fishermen paid little attention. Even in the 1980s, a century after trawlers were found to be destroying the North Sea, many still believed that the codfish population of the Grand Banks, known as the northern stock, was in no danger because it was one of the most plentiful fish populations in recorded history. The skiff fishermen went to scientists, and many scientists agreed with them. But the government had their own scientists who reported that the northern stock was not in danger. So many fish were being caught and so much money was being made that the government didn't want to listen to a few old-fashioned skiff fishermen. They were providing jobs processing fish at sea for many people who had not had any work before the 200-mile limit. The Canadian fleet was landing huge quantities of cod, more than ever before, so there had to be a lot of fish out there. Off to the side. For centuries, cod fishermen in Newfoundland braved the icy waters of the Grand Banks in dories, small boats with high sides and flat bottoms that offered little protection against the raging sea. But they didn't consider the other possibility, that the catches were large because they were catching all of the fish. Ralph Mayo, a marine biologist in New England, compared the problem of measuring fish populations to measuring icebergs. It is generally agreed only 10% of an iceberg is actually visible above the ocean. The other 90% is hidden under the ocean. Mayo called this the perception problem. With fish, he said, you see some cod and assume this is the tip of the iceberg, but it could be the whole iceberg. And in the case of the cod, it turned out to be the entire iceberg. What happened on the Grand Banks is that modern fishing had become so powerful, so effective, the fishermen were able to hunt down every last fish in a dying population without realizing that it was dying. In the case of the codfish on the Great Banks, the catches were quite large until suddenly there were no more fish. So in 1992, John Crosby, the Canadian fishing minister, announced that the northern stock had completely vanished. No one would be allowed to fish cod in the Great Grand Banks until the population was replenished. 30,000 Newfoundland fishermen instantly lost their jobs. The island province was plunged into poverty. In 1994, the ban was extended to almost all the fishing grounds in the area. These were seen as temporary measures, but more than 15 years later, the cod population has shown no sign of recovery, and it seems the people of Newfoundland will not be getting back their livelihoods. There are still cod there, but the population has not regenerated. Perhaps the cod had lost its place in the food chain, and other animals were now eating its food. Perhaps, as Darwin had suggested, the population had become too few to sustain the species. Rarity, Darwin had stated clearly, leads to extinction. But at least the fundamental debate was now over. There could be no denying that overfishing was a real threat, that human populations, even the most numerous, could be permanently destroyed by the unrestrained act of humans. Now the debate shifted from the question of whether overfishing was leading to the decline of fish in the ocean to what should be done to prevent this from happening. The Story of Crom and Ailot, Part 6. On Ailot's 14th birthday, Crom took her back to the Caribbean to go snorkeling again. The beachfront hotel, where they once stayed, had since fallen into disrepair as though it hadn't been cared for in years. Wow, Ailot, this place has really changed. As they walked to the beach, they noticed how few people were in the water. "Look, Dad, there are no more fishermen on the beach anymore." That's not good. The water had become green and slimy. Gross. What is this stuff? It's algae. Yuck. Things were very different underwater, too. Parts of the reef were still alive, but most of it was brown and dead, covered in algae. All the brightly colored fish they had seen on their last trip were now gone. When they surfaced, Ailot began to cry. "What happened, Dad? Did they take too many parrotfish?" "Well, that didn't help, but..." Crom explained that the hotel was built too close to the shore, causing mudslides and blocking out the sun, which choked the reef to death. "The hotel is the main problem. Dad, I want to go home now." "Me too, Ailot. Me too."